Hello and welcome to the first oral communication lecture, the first lecture given after the introduction to the course. In this lecture I'm going to recapitulate briefly on some of the things we introduced in the first introductory lecture. Then I'm going to say some words about effective communication, and finally, I'm going to introduce you to some basic aspects of public speaking skills. Now, in the introductory lecture, we talked about the concept of communication, and we mentioned different kinds of definitions, and concluded that quite commonly, communication is about the negotiation of meaning. So it is about an interactive process in which the sender and the receiver jointly try to agree upon meaning. We also talked about some very overall and very basic principles of good communication, and these relate to what the American scholars Locker and Kaczmarek call payback. The first of these letters, the P, refers to the purpose of the communication. Then there is the A, which refers to the audience of the communication. Then there is the I, which refers to information. What kind of information should we include? And then the B, what kind of benefits will the reader or the listener be looking for? And similarly, what kind of objections may the reader or the listener have? And finally, we need to take into consideration the context. And the third thing that we introduced in the first lecture was classical rhetoric as a backdrop to what we're going to talk about today, namely presentation skills in practice. Okay, then I'll go on to say a little bit about the concept of effective messages. According to Locker and Kaczmarek, it is important in professional communication that communication is effective. Now, this may not always be the purpose. So the overall thing to think about is payback, the purpose. And of course, if the purpose in a communication situation is to socialize, if that's the purpose, then we don't need to be effective. But Locker and Kaczmarek say in professional settings, quite frequently we need to be effective when we communicate, and therefore it's important that communication is clear. What is it that we really mean? We need to speak clearly, and we have to write in as clear manner as possible. Secondly, we need to make sure that the communication is complete. I have experienced time and again when I write emails to other people that I forget to include something important. For example, if I invite to a meeting and I forget to say where we should meet, then I will very quickly get a response to say, okay, we can meet, but where should we meet? And then I would have to sit down again on my computer and write another email. And this is sort of not very efficient. So because I need to write 2 emails rather than 1. So if I had been thinking about the completeness of the message, I would have remembered to include where to meet, and that would have made the communication more effective. Thirdly, it is of course important that we are correct. So if I'm sending out an email to invite people to a meeting and I write the wrong room number, let's meet in C465, and then we should be 66, then that could be potentially problematic. Also, Locker and Kaczmarek are quite concerned with the time issue here. So they say that we should try to keep it short and to the point in order to save the reader's time. because people in professional settings, they very often have to read quite a lot. So the more effective we can be, the more to the point, the better it will be for our receivers. Then, of course, we can criticize this and say, okay, but this would depend on the situation, on the context, on the purpose. In some cases, I mean, we want to socialize, we don't want to save the reader's time, but that would be a different purpose. We're now talking professional communication in organizations or in business. Lastly, they say it's always important to try to build goodwill, to try to use a positive emphasis when we communicate, and try to focus on the reader or the listener, not yourself. And this is, of course, very important for teachers. I mean, teachers will have to work with parents, will have to work with management, have to work with pupils, not to mention those. And in those cases, it's important to try to deliver your messages in positive ways. And we'll get back to some very concrete ways of how this can be done. Now, we started last time by talking about classical rhetoric and the art of persuasion from the antiquity. Today we're going to elaborate on this, and we're going to present 3 other approaches or models for presentations. So we'll start with classical rhetoric, elaborate a little bit there, and then we'll go on to talk about what is known as the AIDA approach to presentations. Then we'll mention a more what I have called a traditional analytical approach. This is just my term for it. It's something you can find when you read introductory books on communication and how to speak in public. This is very often the approach that comes up. And fourthly, we're going to mention Locker and Kaczmarek's model or approach, which also has elements which are similar with the other presentation models. Okay, we mentioned Aristotle's persuasive appeals. Aristotle says that when we appeal to people, it can either be based on reason or our logos. We try to persuade people by appealing to the rational faculties. I want you to read this because this is the logical way to do it. Or I can try to appeal to people's emotions, to their feelings. You know, if you follow this advice, I will be happy. Or the example I used in the first lecture was, trying to persuade people to donate money to charity. You can show pictures of starving children. That will appeal to people's feelings. Lastly, there is what Aristotle calls calls ethos, which means appeal based on the character of the speaker. So whenever you stand up in front of an audience to speak, you will be judged not only on the basis of what you're saying, but also how you're saying it, and how you stand, and how you're dressed, and all these kinds of things which are at play in communication. We'll touch upon some of these as we go along in the rest of this presentation today. Now, in classical rhetoric, the Romans said, if you want to give a speech, you should follow the following steps. First of all, inventio. You need to think about what ideas to present, and these ideas need to fit the purpose of the presentation. So it's kind of a brainstorming session when you're trying to think about, okay, what do I want to communicate today, and what is the purpose, and we can add to this what is the audience and so on. So this was the sort of invention, the outset, the starting phase of planning a presentation. Secondly, the Romans said you have to think about dispositio, the structure of the speech. How should you organize the elements that you want to include? And thirdly, thinking about the purpose and the audience and the elements, you need to think about what kind of language to use, the style, elocutio. And the Romans had this tendency for learning by heart, memoria. So they memorized their stuff very typically, learning what they were going to say, learning this by heart before presenting it. And at last stage, pronunciatio, which means the delivery of the speech, where you have to think about your pronunciation, your volume, your pitch, and so on and so forth. I showed you last time the painting of Demosthenes. He was practicing oratory at a beach in the storm with rocks or pebbles in his mouth in order to practice pronunciatio, this last phase. And then, as was also mentioned last time, to the Romans, it was, of course, they also, of course, understood that presentations need to be adapted. They need to fit the audience. So they use this concept of decorum, which is sometimes translated as appropriateness of discourse. In other words, fit your subject matter to the audience. And this, of course, is something we can see today, that also introductory books on public speaking, they always advise you to think about the audience. And it's logical. I mean, if you want to speak to children, you have to speak differently than if you're speaking to professionals, to grown-up professionals. Paybock is of course basically the same thing. It's just elaborated a little bit. Okay, so much for the classical approach to presentations. Then we can go on to the AIDA approach. This was something which was developed in America in the 1950s or 60s, which was an approach much used in marketing or in sales to make a customer take action and buy a product. And today, for example, I could have started this lesson today by saying that, okay, are you aware of the fact that 60% of the students who don't read the lecture notes that have been put out on the internet, 60% of the students, they will fail the exam. Now, I don't know even if this is true, but if I started my lecture in this way today, if it were true, I mean, provided that this were true, if I started my lecture in this way, it would probably have caught your attention. Because as students in a course such as this, you will, I assume, be very concerned about the exam and doing well at the exam. So if I start, as they say in the AIDA approach, you should always start by getting the listener's attention. And for those of you going to work with teenagers, this can be a challenge, because sometimes they are a bit bored and they are used to infotainment on a high level, so it can be difficult to get their attention. But then they say you should think about this. Have a startling statement or a provocative question or something that will make them wake up, get their attention. And this is sort of classical in the AIDA approach. And then they say if you've got their attention, if you have made them wake up, try to make them interested in what you have to say. What has this got to do? You know, if I say to you 60% of the students they fail the exam, okay, what has this got to do with what we're doing now? Try to relate this to what you're saying to make the audience interested. Desire. Arouse the audience's desire for buying your product. sort of it's an elaboration of the previous point. You make people want to do as you say. And of course, now we're talking sales. Sales is sometimes different from teaching, of course it is. But it's about, you know, keeping people's attention and making people want to take action. And we'll get back to some of these points. They are relevant for presentations in some respects, and we're just presenting this now to make you aware of it. Then I'll leave the AIDA approach and go to the traditional analytical approach, as I have called it. In this case, it's a matter of thinking about some features. First of all, of course, back to the purpose, objectives, as Locker and Kasmarek say. What do we want to achieve? If I want to irritate people, I sometimes say to students, if you want to irritate people, just do what you please. If you want to consciously persuade people, sometimes you need to think very carefully about how you go along doing this. And this obviously involves knowledge of the material, but also knowledge of the audience. What kind of an audience are you speaking to? And then you need to think about the planning of your presentation. On the basis of the objectives, the purpose, and the audience, what kind of elements should you include? You see the similarity with the classical rhetorical approach, where they say you have to think about inventio and then dispositio. You plan in order to structure your presentation well. So organization then in this phase is also important. And as you go along, you have to think about what kind of information to include. The next point then, when you have planned everything, organized it, you need to think about the delivery. How should you go about giving the presentation? What about the language? What about the non-verbal communication and so on? But delivery is first of all concerned with the language. And then a good piece of advice is to keep it clear and simple and fluent. And my experience as an external examiner or an examiner at oral exams, I've seen quite a few presentations, and I think one of the major problems for novices or those who haven't presented many times, those who have little experience with public speaking, one of the problems is that people get nervous and they speak too fast. So if people could just slow down, that would be that would make many presentations so much better. And then it's in most cases, I would say it's important to try to keep it natural spoken. Some years ago in the academic world, people tried to show off by using a very complicated, very sophisticated language, difficult words, many loan words, long sentence structures, and so on. My experience is that today it's more a matter of getting through to the audience, use simple, natural, spoken language. I think that in most cases would be the best thing to do. Relating to what I said about people being nervous and speaking too fast is that also they don't take too many pauses. So it goes very fast and talking very fast and they don't take pauses and people lose track of what they're saying. So don't worry about taking a pause. I can take a pause there for 5 seconds. I can also do this when I have 200 people in front of me. I don't care. People don't really care if you take a pause for 5 seconds. But if you're new to the game, if you haven't given many presentations, and you're standing there for the first time, you feel 5 seconds is like an hour, and then you really want to get this over with. But slow down, take some pauses, look at the audience. That's okay. They're not going to eat you, hopefully. But taking pauses, trying to slow down is important for good presentations. Then about body language, relates to the same thing. When you get nervous, it's easy to start fickling, or you can't keep your hands calm. You start doing many things, and it looks a bit awkward. And this then relates to ethos, the character of the speaker. So if you're able to sort of stand in an upright position, keep your hands fairly calm, look at the audience, that would give a better impression. It's easy to say, but it's important to think about. And I think much of this relates to the practice. The more practice you get, the more you will feel comfortable in front of an audience, and the more composed and relaxed you will appear. So distinct, clear gestures. Sometimes you can use body language to emphasize things. I'm going to mention 3 persuasive appeals. Number 1, which is logos. Number 2, which is pathos. Number 3, which is ethos. So you use body language to emphasize, to underline what you're saying. Yeah, I mentioned eye contact. In most Western contexts, it's a good idea to try to get eye contact with the audience. This is, of course, culturally determined. It depends on what kind of an audience you have. Yes. Okay, we've been through this now. As for visual aids, too many presenters have too fancy visual aids. That's very often just distracting. Try to keep it clear and simple. Locker and Kaczmarek say use only 3 points per slide. So in that case, this would be too many points. I don't quite agree with 3 points, but I think don't have too much text. Font size 28 is fine. Not too long sentences. Try to keep it short. That's the best thing. A white background. Black letters, clear font types. Arial is a good one. Don't try to make it too fancy. Doesn't come across as professional. Yeah, efficient and professional use of equipment. I think this is not that problematic to people today who are used to PowerPoint and video cameras and what have you. Okay, so the 3 things to keep in mind in the traditional analytical approach would be: think about the content, the message, what are you actually saying? You need to analyze the purpose, you need to know your topic, and you need to know how to present your topic. Secondly, as we said, the audience is important. You need to know something about the variables or the aspects of the audience: age, sex, educational background, geographical location, and so on. And in terms of form, you need to think about dressmaking, you need to think about how you speak, you need to think about your body language, and you need to think about your visual aids. It is sort of natural, but I think it's important to be conscious of these different factors, because too often people just start off presenting things and they don't take some of these aspects into consideration. Okay, then just a few words about Locker and Kaczmarek's approach to good presentations. Locker and Kaczmarek, they mention quite a few things when it comes to presentation. The first thing they talk about is types of presentations, and they distinguish between informative presentations, persuasive presentations, and what they call goodwill presentations. Informative is informational, like the presentation I'm giving now. I'm informing you about how to give presentations. Then there are persuasive presentations where you're trying to sell something or try to make the audience act. And then you have goodwill presentations where you are sort of praising somebody if somebody has done something great, and you're standing up at a conference dinner to say something positive about this person, that would be a goodwill presentation. Yeah, and then they say something about these aspects that I've already touched upon, but I'll just go quickly through them. They talk about the planning of a presentation. They talk about the importance of creating a strong opener and a strong close. They talk about the structure, the organization of your presentation. They talk about the delivery. And they talk about how to handle questions. We'll take these in turn now. As for planning, they say that obviously PABOK is the overall consideration. To think about purpose, audience, reader benefits, objections and context. But they also think that you should, when you give a presentation in a professional setting, you should try to make your purpose as specific as possible. What is the purpose of my presentation today? Then they have an example of a weak purpose, and they say an example of a weak purpose would be to say, the purpose of my presentation is public speaking. They say this is weak because it is too general. What about public speaking are you going to talk about? You need to specify this, because this theme or topic is too wide. There are too many aspects involved. So they say a better solution would be to say, the purpose of my presentation is to show how good public speaking skills make it easier to get through to people and to give the public speaker a better image. Okay, so I'm sort of narrowing down the scope, I'm being specific. It's not just public speaking, it's how a good public speaking skills make it easier to get across to people, to give the public speaker a good image. In other words, ethos, as Aristotle calls it. Yeah, then they talk about the importance of simplifying everything. And that I think also is a good idea. If you look at good presenters, very often they simplify things, make them very concrete and to the point. So they say, identify one idea you want the audience to take home. Because very often it's difficult for the audience to remember all your points. So you should rather try to narrow down your scope and think about one or two elements that you want your audience to remember. Then they say, simplify your supporting detail so it's easy to follow. Don't use too fancy slides, don't use too much text, don't use too small fonts. These are difficult to follow. Simplify your visuals. And then comes the question, should you involve your audience or not? In this case, for me now, it's very difficult to involve the audience. But in most cases, in Norwegian educational settings, I try to involve audiences. Because I think it's easier to keep them in there. Also for them to feel that they can't just go to sleep. But it depends on the situation, of course. Then we're back to creating a strong opener and a close. This is something that L&C.2.1 Mark is concerned with, because they say too often people fall asleep, or too often you don't catch the audience at the beginning, and then it's difficult to have them following your argument. And this relates to the AIDA approach. So here to me it's obvious that L&C.2.1 Mark are taking this from the AIDA approach. They say a strong opener can be a startling statement, as I just mentioned to you. Do you know that 60% of the students who don't read, they will fail, or something? It needs to be true, of course, but something that will make people wake up. Secondly, you can tell a story, narration or anecdote. In my opinion, very useful for making people wake up. Or using a question or a quotation. My experience also is that if you start telling private stories, it's quite striking to see people waking up. When I see students falling asleep, I start telling them a story about my wife. I'm not giving details, but my wife and I. And once I say my wife and I, it's just, okay, there is something private coming now, because people tend to be so concerned with private matters. So, oh, what about your wife? People wake up. So this is, if you need to think about which elements you want to disclose. But if you tell a private story, then I think it's easier to get people to follow your argument, or to wake up a little. Yeah, the same thing goes for the close. It's important to have a strong end. Then very often a circular structure can be effective. That you end where you started. You started by telling them already 60% of the students who fail, they haven't read the material, for example, and then you end by saying, so if you follow my argument, I'm quite sure that you are not going to end up like one of those 60% who fail the exam, or who don't read and fail. Yeah, and again, feel free to use an anecdote or a statement or a question or a quotation. Okay, as for the organisation, Locker and Kaczmarek say, you can. It's sometimes a good idea to start with the main point, a deductive structure. You start by the most important thing in presentation theory, for example, is to think about PABOK. If that's my main point, I'll start by showing you PABOK, and then I can elaborate and go on with details. That's what we call a deductive structure. Deductive means going from the conclusion or from the generals to the details, the particulars. Yeah, then they mention 5 types of structure. For example, chronological. You tell a story through time. This started 10 years ago, and then you go up through time and to the present. Or it can be a problem course solution approach. You tell somebody about a problem, and then you look at the probable courses, and then you suggest solutions. Or it can be excluding alternatives. You start out with a problem, and then you go through courses, different courses, which solutions should we use to solve this problem, and then you can exclude alternative. You start with alternative 1, exclude this. I don't want to use this solution or apply this solution, and then you go to another one and end up with whatever you think is the relevant solution. Similarly, you can discuss pro and con. What are advantages? What are disadvantages? Or finally, you can do as I'm doing today. You can use a 1, 2, 3 structure. You try to link them logically. Today I'm talking about effective messages at the beginning as a separate point, and then as a point number 2, I'm talking about different presentation models, and then as a point number 3, I'm going to talk about some practical hints or tips. That's 1, 2, 3 structure. Yeah. As for delivery, Locker and Kaczmarek say that you should try to turn your fear into energy. Look at the audience and use natural gestures. Well, that's an easy thing to say if you are extremely nervous. We'll get back to some hints on how to handle nervousness just in a few minutes. Yeah, as we said, also think about the tempo and volume. I think this is a very good piece of advice. Too many people go too fast. I've seen professors, native speakers going far too fast, and people fall off. They're not able to follow. Also think about the volume. To speak sufficiently loudly is important. Yeah, think about opening, think about transitions. When you go from one point to the next, take 2 seconds. Make a 2-second pause. Okay, next point. Consider pitch and intonation. If there is something you want to emphasize, like in the previous point here, if I want to say, think about the opening and transitions, you emphasize by putting more stress or using more force when pronouncing these words. Yeah, dress appropriately. I put this in parentheses because it's difficult to know what appropriate dressmaking is. Depends on what kind of an audience you are presenting to, but perhaps you should do some research to find out what is the appropriate dress in this case. But don't underestimate dress. I've seen students at oral exams coming in wearing very nice clothes, dressing professionally. The boys dressing with a jacket, for example, looks professional, and sometimes you wonder if you as or I as an examiner, if I'm sort of letting myself be influenced by this, because they come across as more professional, in my opinion. Of course, I try not to take this into consideration, but I think it's very interesting to reflect on what kind of an influence clothes actually have. Okay, how to handle questions. Locker and Marek say, should you start by saying, please ask questions at the end, or I will allow questions at the end, or should you say, feel free to ask questions whenever you have them, or I don't really know. But Locker and Marek say that you should always, and this relates to paybook objections, reader objections. Think of every fact or opinion that may challenge your opinion. And then somebody said to me once that, okay, if you get a difficult question, what you can do is to say, could you please repeat the question? This is a bit of a hint, because this gives you 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 seconds to think. Can you please repeat the question? It gives you time to think, rather than answering right there. Then in a typical Anglo-American European context, if you don't know the answer, admit it. It's much better. After questions, take 2 or 3 minutes to restate your main point. That's Locker and Marek's advice. Okay, so some practical tips then. How can you handle nervousness? Well, the famous American writer Mark Twain, he once said, there are 2 types of speakers, those who are nervous and those who are liars, meaning that everyone is nervous when presenting to an audience, and I think that's true to some extent. But I also think that you will become less nervous when you get the experience, when you get the practice. So it's important to practice. And I can tell you from my own part, I frequently practice in front of the mirror to get this practice. That may look stupid, but I think it's good practice. So just something for you to think about. But there are other pieces of advice also that you can use. My experience is that it's always a good idea to be well prepared. The better prepared you are, the better it will go. That's my experience. Sometimes also I know that if I'm going to be nervous, if I'm presenting to people that make me a bit nervous, I will memorize the first lines I'm going to say. I will write them down on a piece of paper and I will memorize them so I can start, it gets me going. And when I get going, I always calm down. After a few minutes, I always calm down. So it's a one technique for getting started. Yeah, and then some people say, focus on your strengths. What are your strengths? Perhaps you have a wonderful, I don't know, American accent. Okay, that's your strength. Perhaps you are proficient at dressmaking, or you have dressed really well today. You know that you put a lot into your dressmaking. Okay, that's a strength. Perhaps you are the kind of person who has a very positive attitude, who's easy to talk to, who's outgoing, smiling, who comes across as sociable and positive. That's one of your strengths. Perhaps you know your material really well. That's one of your strengths. And then some people say you can consider psychological relaxation techniques. breathing techniques, for example, mental training, etc., which help you relax in a presentation situation. I'm personally not an expert on these techniques, but I'm sure that there are good techniques out there which can be used. The final point, which I found really useful, is to practice. Practice makes, if not perfect, it makes you so much better. So I think it's a really good piece of advice for becoming confident in a presentation situation. Yeah, then how to handle nervousness in terms of, turn your nervousness into energy, Lokarenko's Mark say. I think this is, that is an easy piece of advice from somebody writing a book. But I think using positive emphasis is a good idea. Try to focus positively on the subject, on what you can contribute to the audience, and I think this may help you. Then a few words on the importance of preparation. It's important to prepare well. And this means creating a good structure so that it's not just jumbled. You have thought through very carefully what to put first, what to continue with, then what to end with. I have had good help from cue cards. You know, a cue is a little help or a little sign or something. You can have cards like this, you can write down the main points, and this can help you. This is a cue card. If I'm going to give important presentations, I try to familiarize myself with the room to find out where I'm going to stand, where my computer will be, where the projector will be, where people will be sitting, how can I move about, and so on and so forth. Always a good thing to get into the presentation mood. Knowing how to know and use the equipment is important. And in that respect, I would also say always have a backup. Always have a plan B. Whatever happens, always have a plan B. Sometimes equipment breaks down or is not usable. Then you should always have a plan B. You should always be able to do this using just yourself and a whiteboard or whatever you have to present. Don't get stuck just because the equipment breaks down. Yeah, as I said, I used to practice in front of the mirror. I find it's really useful. And in a practical situation, show up in good time is always a good piece of advice. Sometimes you need time to get into your computer. Sometimes you need time to, familiarize yourself. Things may crop up. When I give important presentations, I always show up half an hour before to make sure that everything will be set when I start. Okay, I mentioned the plan B. Always have a plan B. Finally, I'm going through a list of advice which was given once by an American pundit. The public speaker's 10 commandments. I don't think all are equally relevant for you, but you can have a look at them. Firstly, have something to say. Now we have been talking so much about the form of the presentation, how you should be standing and walking and talking and so on, but have something to say. The content is the most important thing, they say. Secondly, speak with passion. Put yourself into the speech. Don't just stand there reading. If you're standing there reading very slowly it may sound a bit monotonous and people don't get what you're saying and it's not very... So try to, put yourself in the speech. Thirdly, organize well. Fourthly relates to point number 2. Put yourself in the speech. Speak with passion. Know your material. Communicate it to the audience in a good way. Respect yourself Respect your audience. Respect words and speak clearly. Keep time limits. Use humour. And smile. Well, perhaps all of these points won't be equally important always, but I think they are worth thinking about. Okay, that's all I had concerning effective messages and public speaking. Next time I'm going to talk some more about persuasive messages and how we can build goodwill.